On Capitol Hill, the battle over the Supreme Court vacancy is heating up. Senate Republicans say they're ready to vote on President Trump's nominee before the election, and they don't even know who that nominee is yet. Democrats on the other side calling the rush unprecedented and a move to take away Americans' health care.
Never in the history of the United States of America have we ever confirmed a Supreme Court judge from July the 1st of the year of the election up to Election Day. It never happened before. And it's just going to divide our country further.
Looks like we'd be voting on this before the election. I think that's perfectly fine. I think if somehow we can't hit those marks, we're still going to vote on this, and we should have plenty of time.
NBC News correspondent Leigh Caldwell joining me now from Capitol Hill. Leigh, so far just 2 Republicans are against a confirmation before the election. Here's what Joe Biden said about that earlier.
2 people have announced, had the guts to announce that they will wait till the election is over. If 2 others stand up and do the right thing, then it'll be put off until the election. If he wins, then he gets to go forward with the nominee that he wants to name. And if he loses, then I get to make that pick, but I won't be able to make that pick until January 21st.
Leigh, are there any other Republicans who are likely to go against the president here? I mean, we've already heard Mitt Romney say that he supports a vote. So who's potentially left?
There isn't anyone left, really. It's pretty much baked in, Allison. The only thing that Republicans were deciding on is if they would hold this vote before Election Day or after. And that decision seems to be made as well, too. They are going to plow forward and try to get it done before Election Day. You played that clip of Senator Roy Blunt, who is a member of Republican leadership and a very close ally of the Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, saying that is in fact their plan to move forward and hold this vote before November 3rd. I want to say that is the first time that we have heard from a member of Republican leadership come out and say it that clearly that is what they are going to try to do. Prior to this, we were hearing people's personal opinions without any wink and nod from the Majority Leader, who keeps his cards very close to his vest. So the fact that one of his lieutenants, Senator Blunt, came out and said that is the goal is a real indication of where they're thinking here, and they're going to try to get this done extremely quickly, Allison.
Leigh, as we've mentioned, Republicans want to start this confirmation process in the first half of October and move things right along. For people who aren't familiar, how will this process go?
So the first thing that's going to happen is the president has to nominate someone. And so the fact that we're talking about already this person being seated on the court before the November 3rd election is just insane within itself, because we're expecting the president to name someone on Saturday. Then that person's name would be sent to the Senate Judiciary Committee, where the committee led by Senator Lindsey Graham, and the members would do some investigating into this person's background. There will be an FBI background check. There will be a hearing, and that hearing is expected, as you mentioned, to happen either the week of October 5th or the week of October 12th. And then the committee will vote on this person being moved out of committee, and then once it passes, it goes to the Senate floor, where the entire Senate will vote on this person, and then if it passes, of course, they will sit on the Supreme Court very quickly after.
Look, Leigh, you said it's kind of nuts. We don't even know who the nominee is yet, but we already seem to know how this may go. Thank you so much for talking us through the process. I know we'll be talking to you again a lot more this week.
Yep, thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.